Welcome on air. So I'm super excited today to have Whitney from Anzu Partners for an exclusive Fireside chat. So welcome to the grill.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
And maybe as a first question, before I jump with all of the burning questions I have, why don't we start with you explaining maybe who you are and what is it that you do at Anzu?
Sure, and thank you so much for having me. It's a pleasure to be with everyone today. I'm Whitney Haring-Smith. I'm one of the managing partners at Anzu Partners. We're a firm that manages about $1 billion, focused on industrial and life science investments. And in many ways, PropTech is that combination. It's an industrial facility where living beings come to work or to play or to live every day. And so it's a delight to be able to talk about it with you today. We have a portfolio of about 40 portfolio companies that range across the spectrum, from Singapore to Minneapolis to Massachusetts.
Awesome. And you flew all of the way from Washington, D.C. to here, Brussels. So we are grateful to have you. So I would like to have your view on the idea of impact because, real estate construction, 40% CO2 emissions, everybody knows. But where it's a bit less easy for me to unpack is the link between social impact and real estate. So I would like to understand, according to you, what is the link between construction, real estate, and everything related to social impact? So mental health, well-being, and all of this.
Sure. So when I think about some of those softer elements, mental health, well-being, a lot of them have to do with fundamental quality of life. Are we building an economic system where people can find good jobs, where they can find the opportunity to live and work in the same environment so that they don't necessarily have to be in a car for a half an hour or an hour? There are parts of the US where people are regularly commuting 2 hours to get to work.
Yeah.
And so when I think about where real estate starts to have an impact, it's not just the steel or the cement that we use to make a building. It's also how we think about building an ecosystem around it.
Yeah.
And whether we have the transportation nodes, whether we have the childcare centers, whether we have the schools that are needed to build an ecosystem. And that ecosystem is what lets us have laboratories that come up with new vaccines. It's what lets us have schools where we come up with totally new inventions. And it's what lets us have some of the basics of parks and economic development that make simple quality of life better.
Yeah, love it. Crystal clear. Now, maybe if I kind of do a shift in my narrative, I would like to understand, you see a lot of founders. You have backed multiple companies. I think you have unicorns in your portfolio, etc. And so I was recently reading this interview of a founder of a multi-time unicorns, saying like how hard it can be to run a company. And so how all-consuming it can be to run a startup. And so counterintuitively, I'm also a founder and serial founder. And so I have sometimes a feeling that if you don't succeed in your private life, it will be harder to succeed in your professional life, because when you achieve a certain level of happiness in your private life, it can fuel you in energy, optimism, etc., give you drive. But at the same time, maybe if you're not ready to sacrifice everything, you're not a good founder. And so I would like to understand, like, what are your views on this idea of can we sacrifice? Should we sacrifice everything to run the company? But aren't we shooting ourselves in the foot if we do that?
So my wife also founded a company with me, of all things. And we're still married. We're still happy. We have 2 wonderful children. And she likes to say that you should be an entrepreneur if you can't be anything else. If you can't conceive of your life as a consultant or as a doctor or as an engineer, then you should be an entrepreneur. But if you can conceive of your life doing anything else, it is so difficult and so challenging that you should probably think about what your alternatives are. But for many entrepreneurs, they can't think about anything else. Last week, I was in Washington, D.C., and at a small table, another very successful founder got asked, what would you do if you didn't lead your current company? Paused for a moment, thought about it. He said, I guess I think I would have to start something else. I don't know what else I would want to do. And that kind of conviction is necessary. I don't think you have to necessarily have suffered, but that kind of high conviction is needed. There is another element, though, when I think about what helps founders pull through. And it's not necessarily suffering. but it is accepting that we don't control everything. We don't have the power to determine everything about the world around us. Sometimes we get mugged by life. And this element of acknowledging you can do everything right and your company can fail is really important to being able to bounce back from the bad weeks, bounce back from the bad months. Just today there was news released that an estimated 3,200 venture-backed companies shut down this year in 2023.
How much?
3,200. About the same as just shy of the total PropTech ecosystem in Europe.
Crazy.
And they had received investment of $27 billion. Now, I'm sure some of those companies had fundamental problems, but not all of them.
Yeah.
Many of them were victims of circumstance outside their founder's control, maybe even outside of their whole team's control.
Yeah.
And so being able to bounce back from that without taking it out on your family, without taking it out on your friends is really important. There are plenty of situations we've seen where teams that don't develop that equanimity around uncertainty suddenly find themselves not just surprising themselves, but surprising their investors, surprising their boards. And that obviously has a really bad impact for us as investors, but also for the teams and the businesses that are there.
So you touched upon many different topics that I would like to deep dive in. The importance of resilience, bounce back, as you say, and also the question of importance of suffering. So if we start maybe with the first question, I was speaking recently with one of the managing director of JLL Spark, so one large corporate venture fund of JLL, the brokers, and so I was asking him, the hardest part of due diligence often is the HR due diligence. So how do you assess the quality of founders? And he was telling me that one of the things he's looking at is their resilience. So how and they prove in the past, have they proven in any way some sort of resilience? Are they able to bounce back? Are they able to navigate through crisis, etc.? So the idea of resilience for him was very important. And I have the feeling that when you suffer, it gives you maybe more substance and also more drive, and maybe more legitimacy for success than if you haven't suffered at all. If you have ever suffered and everything was always granted to you, you never merited anything, maybe you have less substance, maybe you're less substantial. Yeah, I don't know how to say. So what's your opinion on this idea of resilience?
So resilience is important, but having suffered, I think, is hard to set as a criteria, in part because you can't really plan to suffer. You can't really plan to fail. The nature of suffering, the nature of failing is that it is unexpected. You thought it was going to be okay, and then it wasn't.
Yeah.
And that mismatch between your expectations, that failure of your great expectations, is central to making a failing or a suffering real. And as a result, if you meet a really interesting business and a really talented founder, you can't tell them to just go out and immediately suffer. Go out and immediately fail. Yeah, go now. Go. You can't plan for it. And so one of the things that I think about is not whether the founder has suffered and not whether the founder has failed. Yes, it's interesting if they have and absolutely want to talk about it.
Maybe if they've done it.
But the way I think about it is when I think about the business, do I want to talk about the problems of the business with the founder? And does the founder want to talk about the problems of the business with me? Because if I don't want to talk about them with the founder, I'm not going to have fun at board meetings. He's not going to enjoy, or she's not going to enjoy having me at those board meetings, and I'm not going to be able to add value. And so for me, I don't necessarily reflect on what suffering or what failings they've gone through, because you can't plan for that. But I know that we will have problems in every business, and I want to know that I want to talk about it with that founder, and that founder wants to talk about it with me.
Yeah, okay, clear. The other topic that you discussed was the maybe related more to the cost of success. And so I remember an interview from a French startup guru. I was saying that if you want to build the next Google, you need to be ready to sacrifice everything. And if you're not ready to sacrifice everything, then maybe you're not meant to be an entrepreneur. Okay, this is blunt statement, etc. But then he was explaining that you should have the drive to be able to really so when you have such a drive, you can't have balance in your life. Everything must be for the success of your project. And so I would like to have your views about the cost of the success, because if you sacrifice everything and then you're successful, but you lose yourself, you I don't know, you enter depression, whatever, and maybe it's too expensive, maybe it doesn't worth it. And so what is the right balance between what you can accept to sacrifice in order to be successful, and what's maybe too expensive, like health?
So I think it's a really good question whether you're successful at all if you lose your health or lose your family. Taking a shift out of the business context, earlier in my career, I used to work overseas. I would work in Afghanistan or Iraq or other locations, and I loved the work. I loved the people I worked with. I loved the problems we tried to address. But I looked at the people around me, people who worked for the UN, for the United Nations, people who worked in the Foreign Service, and many of them had sacrificed parts of their health or relationships with their families in order to be overseas doing this work. And that was a big consideration for me when I said, I don't want to be in Kabul in 10 years. I don't want to be in Iraq in 20 years. And so that's part of the career change that led me ultimately to the Boston Consulting Group and then into becoming a venture capitalist. And I think that when I see founders that are able to be honest with themselves about the trade-offs they're willing to make, it also means that the teams around them are willing to be honest with them. Because when you sacrifice everything, one of the trades that you often make is you sacrifice honesty around yourself. You don't have deputies who will tell you the business won't work because they worry that they'll just become another thing that you got sacrificed. And that, I think, is a real cost, right? Having people around you, who know how you work, who have seen successes, who have seen failures, where certainly can't have people who are wrong every day, but where every once in a while somebody has a interesting idea and it doesn't work out. And that's okay.
Yeah.
That's part of success, failure, learning, testing. And so when you say to be an entrepreneur, you have to sacrifice everything, maybe that's one kind of entrepreneur, and maybe that's one kind of model of success that somebody wants to have. But when you sacrifice everything for your business to succeed, there are also things in the business that get sacrificed.
Yeah. Yeah. And the idea of honesty for me is very important. And it's also related to the awareness, because you need to be aware of the sacrifice that you're making. You need to be honest with yourself, but you be conscious, be aware of what is it that you're deciding not to pursue in some way. But okay, moving on, last question, because in a few minutes you will be on the stage sweating, hopefully. So my question is, if you look back behind your shoulder, because it's this time of the year, December, where you can, do a bit of an assessment of what you've done, etc., etc. But looking at everything so far, since the beginning of your career, is it one thing that you're the most proud of that you would be willing to share today? Is there, not is it?
Sure. So I think it is not straightforward to maintain a good working relationship and a good family at the same time. And I'm very proud that I have been with the same partners that co-founded Anzu since the beginning. And that hasn't been every day is a good day. And I've been with my family, where we now have 2 kids. And those are not because every day is fun and not because every day is easy, but because we work together through the tough points. Now, the flip side of it is trying to understand where on the business side you would set boundaries. We're not married to everyone we work with, and so how do we think about when someone's pushed it too far, when we have to ultimately say, this is just not something that I'm willing to tolerate. And those, for me, are always some of the most difficult calls, because you want to try to maintain relationships. You want to try to be somebody who works from January to December with the same team, and that's not always possible. Those are certainly the most difficult decisions for me.
Yeah.
And when I look back on any given year, where those broke are almost always the things that I regret from the year.
Yeah. Okay. thank you for this. I appreciate. So this was Whitney from Anzu Partners, 1 billion VC fund AUM, coming from Washington DC, and we will have the pleasure to have him on stage in a few minutes. Thank you.
Thank you so much. It's a pleasure.